Today's presentation will focus on how we get new species. Before we begin, a species is any group of animals or plants that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, and those fertile offspring also need to produce additional offspring. We're going to be looking at 4 different pathways. We'll look at geographical isolation, which leads to reproductive isolation. We'll look at divergent and convergent evolution and artificial selection. I'm going to start with artificial selection. We've mentioned this in the past when we've talked about genetics, but basically with artificial selection, humans pick the desirable trait. So it's not natural selection, it's human selection. And this has been a very common practice really since humans have stopped hunting and gathering. One of the big differences with selection today is that we can genetically modify organisms, and that's what GMO stands for, genetically modified organism. It's fairly controversial, but generally speaking, we're probably all eating some genetically modified organisms. And a good example of that would be corn. Corn, whether it's oil, syrup, solids, whatever, are in most of the things that we consume. But there's a lot of genetically modified products, and some of them are listed in this slide: cotton, soy, alfalfa, etc. One of the big differences with genetically modifying an organism and artificially selecting is that you can take organisms from different species and insert genes into each other. So, for example, we can create corn or soy that is resistant to certain diseases by inserting bacteria in them. We can also put things like extra nutrients, specific vitamins. We can make things higher in protein. So there's some positive things about genetically modifying food, but there's also some controversial issues about how does this affect the humans in the long term. Geographical isolation, we've referred to a little bit in the past when we've looked at the founder's effect, and that's just basically how organisms get separated. And the two populations, once they get separated, begin to evolve in different ways for various reasons until they no longer recognize each other, whether that be through song or some sort of mating ritual. Or just genetically, they can't produce viable offspring. It leads to the formation of a new species. Divergent is basically once the species are separated, they begin to adapt to the environmental conditions that they're faced with. And over time, the differences within a population can be significant enough to create a new species. And we're going to be looking at the Galapagos finch evolution as one example.
Our planet has millions of species, over 300,000 beetles alone, 17,000 butterflies, thousands of mammals, fish, and birds, all astonishingly different. How did so many species come to be? To seek insights into that question, researchers are focusing on places where species recently arose, such as the remote Galapagos Islands.
Scientists are making observations and conducting experiments that would have surprised Charles Darwin. And they're discovering new insights into what the great naturalist called the mystery of mysteries: how new species form.
Galapagos Islands are one of the most spectacular landscapes in the world, home to a variety of species that live nowhere else. Biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant have been seeking answers to how species arise by focusing on one of the smaller islands, called Daphne Major.
When we started out, we had no plan for the long term. In fact, we thought it was just going to be just a few years, maybe 2 years.
2 years have turned into a 40-year odyssey. The Grants have returned every summer since 1973.
Oh, that's a bird.
So 3 or
Okay,
6?
that's
3 or 6.
3 metal 6.
Here, they've made some of the most remarkable observations in the history of field research as they studied the famed Galapagos finches. The finches were first brought to scientists' attention by Charles Darwin, when his voyage around South America brought him to this cluster of islands, 600 miles from mainland Ecuador. These volcanic islands are geologically young. They began rising from the ocean floor less than 5 million years ago. At first devoid of life, they now support a modest number of species. Among them, 13 species of finches, found in various combinations on the different islands. The birds live in diverse habitats.
The islands are very different from each other. They differ in size, they differ in topography, and in height.
Larger trees grow at higher elevations, while low islands have mostly cactus, grasses, and shrubs. In these diverse habitats, the finches have evolved many ways to survive.
So, Rosemary, what's the important difference between these birds?
This little warbler finch with its very fine needle-like beak is perfect for picking off insects. This one is the woodpecker finch with a rather more robust beak. It concentrates on beetle larvae and termite larvae. Then we have the cactus finch with a much longer, sharp pointed beak which probes into cactus flowers. And then these 3 species are the large, medium, and small ground finches. So, Sean, the basic idea is the beaks are tools, and you need the right tool for the right job.
The finches look so different that Darwin first mistook them for entirely unrelated kinds of birds. How did the Galapagos end up with so many species of finches?
In terms of the actual history of the finches of the Galapagos, there were many different possibilities. Different kinds of finches could have all come from the mainland separately, or the finches could have all evolved out there on the islands. And what do we know about that?
Well, now we know from DNA evidence that all of the finches are more related to each other than any one is to a species on the mainland. And that tells us only one species arrived on the archipelago and diversified into the 13 species that we see nowadays in the Galapagos. So they've all come from a single common ancestor.
The question then becomes, how did one ancestral population give rise to many different species, each adapted to a different lifestyle? A crucial insight into how adaptation occurs came when the Grants focused on one species on the island of Daphne Major.
A factor of great convenience for us was the small size of the island. That meant that we could walk all over the place.
Oh, there's a bird.
I'll leave that one to you.
The idea was that if we worked really hard, we could follow every individual or almost every individual.
They rose at 5:30 each morning to net the island's medium ground finches.
The beak net is
They measured the size and shape of each bird's beak, the bird's weight, and they tagged them for identification.
the male is 17418.
Year after year they returned, at times tracking over 1,000 finches.
So here's an example of a bird we know intimately over the whole of its lifespan. The number is 5960. We know how many times it bred, which years it bred in, how many mates it had, how many offspring it produced, and then how many of those offspring themselves survived long enough to breed.
Over the first 4 years, little seemed to change. Then in 1977, a terrible drought began.
Virtually no rain fell for the next 18 months.
The vegetation practically disappeared, apart from a few trees without any leaves, and of course the cactus bushes were still there.
Now the medium ground finches had to compete for scarce food.
They started off with a big food supply of small seeds, medium seeds, large seeds. As these small seeds became very scarce, they had to turn increasingly to the large and hard seeds. Well, only birds with large beaks can crack open these woody, spiny fruits.
The birds with the smallest beaks had the most trouble.
They were scraping about amongst the rocks, and their plumage got so worn that they could barely fly.
That year, over 80% of the medium ground finches died.
We would go around looking for birds that had died, and it's very sad to pick up a bird and say 3972. Oh no, not that bird. Oh.
When they inventoried the surviving medium ground finches, they discovered that one trait had made the greatest difference between life and death.
But I'm showing here a distribution of beak depths of the population in 1976. The survivors of this group are shown in black.
Oh. So the larger the beak, the better your chances.
The larger the beak, the higher the likelihood of surviving through the drought of 1977. 18.6 grams.
When they looked at the offspring, they found an even greater surprise. The average beak depth was more than 4% larger than the previous generation. Natural selection had changed the average beak size.
Could you have ever imagined measuring and observing something like this on such a short time scale until you actually did it?
When we started, the answer is no. We could not imagine we would be able to do it.